but they never return from these experiences with any exceptional knowledge that could easily verify their claim. What I'm saying is that there is a way that God can be detected, and this is one of them, and he has not been. Furthermore, religious experiences can be induced in the brain by drugs, electromagnetic pulses, and oxygen deprivation. For example, when pilots undergo high-G training in a centrifuge, they will often experience the kind of tunneling of their vision, narrowing of their vision with light at the end of the tunnel. That is characteristic of the near-death experience that's supposed to have religious significance. Now, you might say God has chosen to hide himself from us. He certainly has, if he exists, has hidden himself from us. However, St. Paul makes it very clear that even though God is invisible, his nature and deity have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. In other words, God may be invisible, but his actions are visible. Theists might respond that God's actions are obvious to those who wish to see them. Well, I would love to see them, but they're not obvious to me or to the millions of other non-believers in the world. Another commonly believed attribute of God is that he listens to entreaties from humans to change the natural course of events. He can be expected to grant a sufficient number of these requests so that the results should be observable. Otherwise, what's the point of praying? Now, many people will testify that they've had their prayers answered. But personal testimony is insufficient since it doesn't rule out other more mundane, simpler, natural explanations. For example, if someone is ill and then recovers after praying, it could be that the prayers had nothing to do with it. After all, the body, sometimes with medical help, does a pretty good job of healing itself. In fact, it works every time, except once, the last time. Now, if prayer had value in healing, we'd have doctors prescribing prayer aspirin. Say 3 Our Fathers and 4 Hail Marys and call me in the morning. Now, convincing evidence for God, a God who answers prayers, can in principle be scientifically demonstrated. It's not impossible, with high probability if it really exists. Well-designed experiments on intercessory prayer should turn up solid, statistically significant results on the success of prayer in healing. In fact, some studies claiming positive effects of prayer have been published in refereed medical journals, the great media hoopla. However, you can't rely on media reports, but need to look at the actual published papers. Applying the same criteria that are used in conventional science when testing extraordinary claims, you'll find that none of the reported effects are significant. Furthermore, most of the experiments are severely flawed, and none of the claimed positive effects have ever been successfully replicated. Perhaps the best study was done by the Mayo Clinic a few years ago. They studied some 800 patients over a period of half a year. Patients were divided up into, they were coronary patients, they're divided up into 2 groups, some prayed for and some not prayed for, and the results were no significant effect that would suggest that prayer had any good whatsoever. So let me summarize. Number 1, the traditional attributes of God are self-contradictory, so such a God cannot exist. 2, the traditional attributes of God are incompatible with objective facts about the world, so such a God cannot exist. Natural explanations are superior to supernatural explanations. No basis exists for anything supernatural. 4, the traditional attributes of God imply actions that should be objectively observed, but they're not. It's possible to hypothesize a God whose attributes are logically compatible with each other, but it does not follow that such a God exists unless he has objectively observable consequences. And as I said, no consequences have been observed. So if God exists, where is he? Thank you.
In the next phase of tonight's discussion, our two debaters will each have 12 minutes to present their rebuttal, the response to the opening statements of their opponent. We will begin with Dr. Craig.
In his opening statement, Victor Stenger presents 4 arguments which he says prove with certainty that God does not exist. Well, can he maintain that high standard of proof? Let's look at the arguments. First, he alleges that the attributes of God are self-contradictory. Now, this is actually my area of specialization as a philosopher, so I was very interested in hearing his arguments here. Unfortunately, we heard merely assertions from Dr. Stenger. I was looking for the argument. Where were his premises? What was the argument that supported these assertions? I don't think that any of the alleged contradictions that he asserted are in fact incompatibilities with each other. For example, take God's perfection versus God's being a creator. According to the Christian view of God, God created the universe for the benefit of the creature, not for his own benefit, not from any imperfection in himself, but rather it is a creation so that we might come to know God, the joy and blessedness of personal relationship with him. So that creation, just like salvation, is totally by God's grace. It is an expression of his overflowing love. The knowledge of God is what we were made for as human beings, and we find our ultimate fulfillment in knowledge of him. He says, what about transcendence versus omnipresence? Well, traditionally, omnipresence has not been interpreted to mean that God is diffused throughout the universe like some sort of invisible ether. Rather, omnipresence means that God is causally active at and knows what is happening at every point in space. And that's entirely compatible with his being transcendent and the cause of space and time. What about his justice versus his mercy? Here I find one of the greatest beauties of the Christian faith is the reconciliation of God's justice and mercy. They meet at the cross. At the cross we see God's love for humanity expressed as the second person of the Trinity dies in our place to take upon himself the death penalty of sin that we deserve. He voluntarily undergoes the most excruciating suffering to reconcile us to God. And yet at the same time we see the justice of God as God's just punishment for sin is meted out, but he takes it upon himself in the person of Christ, so that the justice and the mercy of God meet at the cross. At the cross, we see the most beautiful reconciliation and expression of the mercy and justice of God. Finally, what about immateriality versus being personal? Well, I would invite Dr. Stenger to give any argument to show that persons are essentially material beings. On the contrary, I would say that persons are essentially immaterial beings. We are souls conjoined with a body. God is an unembodied soul, if you will, or mind that transcends the universe. So there's no incompatibility there. So I think philosophers generally recognize that the traditional concept of God, at least as Dr. Stenger has attacked it, is entirely coherent and compatible, and the question is there evidence for such a being? Well, his second argument was that the evil in the world is inconsistent with the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God. Again, he merely asserted this, but I would like to hear the premises to the argument. Philosophers have come to recognize that there is no logical inconsistency between the propositions an all-powerful, all-loving God exists and evil exists. And if Dr. Stenger thinks he can show those are logically inconsistent, then I'd simply invite him to do so. It's generally recognized that no one's been able to show those propositions are inconsistent. In fact, you can actually prove that they're consistent by adding a third premise, namely, God has a morally sufficient reason to permit evil. So long as that is even possible, it follows that those propositions are entirely compatible. The atheist seems to think that if God has morally sufficient reasons to permit evil, then I must somehow be privy to these. But there's absolutely no reason to think that I must know God's mind or know all of the reasons that he has for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. So unless Dr. Stenger can show that it is impossible that God have morally sufficient reasons for permitting pain and evil in the world, his argument is simply invalid. Second thing I would say about this is that I think that paradoxically evil is actually proof of the existence of God. The argument would go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Second, evil exists. Namely, some things are really wrong. 3, therefore objective moral values exist. 4, therefore God exists. So while on a superficial level evil seems to call into question God's existence, on a deeper, more philosophical level,